Codes. Codes are extremely important because they standardize information. So for example, Colorado can be abbreviated a lot of different ways, but if you have a system where Colorado is always 08, then it's a lot easier to know how to search for that. One long code, for example, the SCC codes, which we've talked about some in the fundamentals course, and we will talk more about in this course, describes a process that is extremely specific. So in 10 digits, a lot of information can be packed into a code. For the tribal codes that are used in the emissions inventory system, well, FIPS, the FIPS codes, the Federal Information Processing Standard, those are used for states and counties, whereas for emission inventories, tribes have their own codes. For example, the Kickapoo tribe has a 3-digit code, and states and counties, well, they use FIPS codes. So Kansas's FIPS codes is 20, then Brown County FIPS codes is 013, then the Kickapoo tribe has its own code, that's the tribal EIS code. So it's important to understand that these FIPS codes are great for states and for counties, but tribes have special tribal EIS codes that are 3 digits. Source classification codes. These are vital because these lead you to what calculator and what emission factor is going to be used. There are about 9,000 valid codes for all sorts of different processes. All these different processes have codes. Point sources have codes that are 8 characters long, and non-point, which would be like area sources, a big giant field, non-road sources, so that would be like bulldozers or snowmobiles, on-road sources, event and biogenic sources have 10-character long SCC codes, and that makes sense if you think about just how specific some of these non-point sources are. Every single process in TEISS must have an SCC. That's how everything is organized. It's also used as the primary way of organizing the data in EPA's National Emissions Inventory. Looking specifically at an example SCC for a point source, this is a wheat elevator. The example SEC has 8 characters, and they are in a specific order, and each one builds upon the previous character. So there's the first character is a 3. So that tells us it's some sort of industrial process. The next 2, O2, tells us that, okay, within this industrial process, it has to do with food and agriculture. Then the next 3 digits, 005, tell us that, okay, it's some sort of industrial process, it has to do with food and agriculture, and it's a feed and grain terminal elevator operation. Then the last 2 digits, 01, tell us that in this industrial process having to do with food and agriculture, at this feed and grain terminal elevator, it's the shipping and receiving. So you drill down with every character in the SEC. So when you're searching for the right source classification code, sometimes when you put text in the search box, it won't find what you're looking for. And the fastest way is to just scroll through and try to drill down and search for what you're looking for, keeping in mind the way these are organized. So if you know that it's something having to do with food and agriculture, then you only have to search with all the codes that begin 302, for example, in this case. So you have to be patient in order to find the right code, but it's extremely important because, of course, the calculated emissions are going to be different based upon what the process is, and that's determined by the code. So when we talk about SCC level 1, that means just the 1 digit for point sources, which includes all industrial processes. When we talk about SCC level 3, that means that's the first 3 digits of the code. And you can organize your reports. If you remember when we demonstrated reports in TEISS, and group all of the processes, and therefore all the emissions, that result from different types of processes, and you can organize them and summarize them by these different levels of the codes. And if you want to lump together all your industrial processes, for example, then you would just be talking about all your processes that begin with SCC 3. Looking at source classification codes for all types of sources other than point, so that's non-point, on-road, off-road, etc. These have 10 digits because there's so many more of them. The first 2 digits in this case, the SCC 2 level 2, in this case we're looking at burn barrels, and 26 signifies waste disposal, treatment, and recovery types of processes. Then the next 2 digits, 10, that takes us to the source classification code level 4, which just means the first 4 digits. Okay, so within waste disposal, it's open burning. Then the next digits, so down to the 7 level, so now we tack on 030. So the source classification code level 7 description includes the first 7 characters, and that means within waste disposal, it's a type of open burning, and it's residential open burning. Then you drill down even further and get more specific with the source classification level 10 description, which just means all 10 characters, and that's very specific, and it means this residential burning, what you're burning is household waste. So this very, very specific 10-digit code signifies open burning by residents of household waste. Keep in mind that when you search, for example, in TEISS, you may have a hard time finding exactly what you're looking for. So if you have some idea of the hierarchy of these codes and what you're looking for, then, for example, if you know you're looking for open burning, then you know for sure your SCC code has to begin with probably 26, right, if it's waste disposal. And then you could scroll through and look for open burning and then find residential and household waste. And you could see that if you're burning something else, it probably would produce different emissions. So it's important to get the right code. Now for non-point sources, the entire area, for example, your reservation, is the location, which is sort of like the facility for point sources. So TEISS will lump together and combine the emissions from the non-point SCC processes unless the emission type is different. So for all internal combustion engines, the way that emissions are calculated is there's evaporative emissions, exhaust emissions, and refueling emissions. And what that means is the evaporation from the gas tank, the exhaust, which is probably the majority of the emissions, and then emissions during refueling. Those are different types of emissions. Ultimately, they're combined in the TEISS report by pollutant and then lumped together because you basically have the whole area being like the facility for these non-point sources. So for non-point sources, you will not have the same source classification code multiple times because, as we said, for non-point sources, they're grouped together. And that makes sense if you remember that the whole location is like the facility. So if you've got wood stoves, then all the emissions from those wood stoves are grouped together. Again, the only exception is that TEISS will break it down by these 3 different kinds of emissions for the same source classification code. So we're going to look at TEISS and how these emissions look in linear data entry. So these are the data that we imported from the National Emissions Inventory, and I'm going to click on Input to open up the linear data entry screen where we can look at all this data that we imported. In this case, we're going to look at some of the data in Arizona. Let's look at non-road sources, so I'm going to click here, and then I just want to take a look at how these non-road sources are organized. So I'm going to click on non-road locations, and I'm going to keep it selected at Apache County. Now, non-road processes, and these are all the non-road processes that are going on in Apache County, Arizona. And you can see that under the category Source Classification Code heading, in the column Source Classification Code, we have the same source classification code 3 times. And if you look over here under emissions type, you can see evaporation, refueling, exhaust. Evaporation, refueling, exhaust for the same SCC. And you can look at the actual emissions. So the reporting period is annual. Just verify that in case it's not. For example, if it could be snowmobiles. Then the actual non-road emissions. So again, this is the data that we imported from the National Emissions Inventory from EPA. And you can see that, for example, for toluene, there's an emission listed. And this corresponds, if we go back and look here, what does this correspond to? Here is the 10-digit code. And we could scroll through and see that the same code is here 3 times with 3 emissions listed, for example, for each one of these pollutants. You can add it up for the 3 emissions types, evaporation, exhaust, and refueling, and that equals the amount of, for example, toluene emitted from that SCC level 10 code in this location if you go to the TEISS reports. So I just wanted to show you this is the only time when you're going to have multiple source classification codes in a non-point process when you have these different sorts of emissions. However, they are all added up together in the TEISS report.